Bavaria, spring 1945. The war had officially ended, yet the land behaved as if no one had informed it. Smoke still clung to the rafters of collapsed homes, mingling with the sour scent of wet ash. The village streets were quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if every sound had been swallowed to make room for grief. Brick dust coated the air, drifting like a pale fog around the boots of the American infantry patrol moving cautiously through the ruins. Their uniforms were clean, their steps rhythmic, but everything around them felt bruised, too fragile to withstand even the echo of marching feet. Private Daniel Hayes walked near the rear of the formation, scanning doorways, windows, and the hollow eyes watching from behind them. He had seen civilians in France and Belgium, but the faces here were different, not defiant, not hopeful, simply emptied. They looked like people whose emotions had been looted along with their belongings. Hayes felt the weight of their stares press against him, more unsettling than any sniper scope. It wasn't hatred. It was something worse, bewilderment that life kept going while theirs had stalled in place. The patrol halted near a crooked row of houses that slumped toward each other like wounded soldiers. One cottage in particular drew Hayes' attention. Its roof was sheared in half, the remaining tiles clinging on as if out of pride rather than structural integrity. A woman stood in the doorway, framed by splintered wood and a sagging lintel. She couldn't have been more than 32 or 33, yet her face carried the tightness of someone storing years she had no room for. Beside her stood a thin boy clutching a wooden toy soldier whose paint had all but peeled away. Sergeant Collins motioned for Hayes to check the house. As he approached, the woman stepped aside, wary but composed. Her silence was not coldness, but caution, the instinct of someone who had learned that speaking too soon could cost too much. The boy watched Hayes with curiosity, not fear, an unsettling contrast in a place where fear had become a second language. Inside, the cottage felt colder than the air outside. Light leaked through the shattered roof in thin, uncertain beams, illuminating dust that drifted like ash caught in suspension. A table leaned against the wall at an angle that suggested it had once been repaired and then abandoned halfway. A metal pot sat on the stove, its bottom scraped clean. The smell of damp wood and mildew clung to everything. Hayes felt his chest tighten, not from danger, but from the unmistakable scent of hunger, the kind that softened bones and hollowed voices. He moved through the rooms with trained precision, checking corners and closets for rifles, uniforms, hidden men. There were none, only patched blankets, scattered tools, and the residue of a family surviving on will alone. When he stepped back outside, he hesitated. Regulations forbade unnecessary interaction with civilians, but regulations did not explain how to look at a starving child and do nothing. Quietly, he removed a small tin of beans from his pack and knelt, offering it to the boy with a soft, almost apologetic nod. The boy accepted it as though accepting a piece of the sun. His fingers trembled around the tin. His eyes, wide and dark, flickered with something too complex for a child to name. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. The woman whispered a hoarse "Danke," a word weighed down by the fear of sounding too grateful to an occupying soldier. Hayes stood to leave, just as a groan shuddered through the cottage. A beam inside gave way with a sharp crack, sending debris sliding in slow, ominous motion. The woman gasped, pulling her son close. Hayes lunged without thinking. He dropped his rifle, braced himself beneath the sagging frame, and heaved upward. Dust poured over him in thick clouds as the roof strained, creaked, then settled back into precarious balance. When he stepped away, coughing, the woman pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wide with alarm, and something gentler beneath it. The boy stared at Hayes as if witnessing a miracle. Hayes brushed the dust from his sleeves, awkward under the weight of their silence. He had faced gunfire without blinking, but this quiet, stunned gratitude left him strangely unsteady. Sergeant Collins called again, sharper this time. Hayes gave a quick nod to the woman and turned to rejoin the patrol, but he only managed a few steps before pausing. He looked back. The boy still clutched the ration tin, holding it against his chest like it was proof that the world had not entirely abandoned him. Their eyes met again, brief, wordless, but heavy with meaning. As Hayes walked away, the village reformed around him. Broken walls, burnt beams, and faces that had memorized loss. Yet one cottage now tugged at him like a loose thread. He tried to shake it off, reminding himself that his duty was to his unit, his orders, his country. But beneath that discipline, something stubborn and human began to stir. He did not know the woman's name, nor the boy's. He did not know their story, their struggles, their hopes, if they had any left. But he knew this. In a place where everything had been taken from them, his small act had meant more than he intended. And it was that knowledge, unwelcome yet persistent, that followed him long after the patrol vanished around the bend. By the time the soldiers neared the far edge of the village, Hayes found himself slowing, as if some part of him expected to hear a voice calling him back. Instead, there was only the soft whisper of wind moving through shattered beams. Yet in the quiet, he sensed something forming, a tension, a possibility, a fragile thread connecting him to that ruined home. And though no words had yet been spoken, he felt, deep in his bones, that the boy's silence was temporary, that a sentence waited on the child's tongue, waiting for the right moment to fall suddenly and change everything. The rain arrived without warning, a thin, cold drizzle that slid down the broken rooftops of the Bavarian village like the sky itself was trying to wash the ruins clean. Private Daniel Hayes felt the change in the air as he and his patrol moved along the main road, their boots stirring puddles that reflected the warped silhouettes of collapsed houses. The war had ended, but the landscape still behaved like a battlefield, raw, unsettled, full of wounds that refused to close. When a sergeant dismissed them for a short break, Hayes found his gaze drifting, almost involuntarily, toward the cottage where he had braced that failing beam 2 days earlier. He told himself it was just habit, simple awareness, the mind revisiting places where danger had once seemed possible. Yet even he didn't believe that. He broke away from the group under the pretense of checking the perimeter, though the village was quiet enough to hear even the smallest shift of rubble. As he approached the cottage again, he noticed the door was still damaged, still sagging like a stubborn injury, refusing to heal. Through the dim interior, he saw the widow kneeling beside a pile of salvaged wood, her hands raw from labor. The boy was perched nearby, sorting nails into a small tin, as if it were the most important task in the world. Hayes hesitated at the threshold. He shouldn't be here without direct orders. Eisenhower's non-fraternization rule was clear. No unnecessary contact with German civilians. Yet the woman looked up at him with a tired nod, neither welcoming nor dismissing him, simply acknowledging his existence in the patient manner of someone who had learned to accept what she couldn't control. The boy brightened in a way that cut straight through Hayes's defenses, his small shoulders straightening, as if a soldier's presence somehow fortified the fragile little room. "You're fixing the door," Hayes said quietly, though the statement felt embarrassingly obvious. He stepped inside just far enough to avoid the rain. The widow answered with a soft jaw, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She avoided his eyes, not out of hostility, but out of an instinctive caution, as though meeting a soldier's gaze too long might carry consequences she wasn't prepared to face. Her voice held the rasp of someone who hadn't spoken much in days, and Hayes wondered how many conversations this household had lost since the war began. He knelt beside the doorframe, testing the wood with careful fingers. "I can help," he murmured. It wasn't a suggestion. It felt more like a reflex, an impulse born from the uncomfortable memory of leaving the cottage partly stabilized, knowing it needed more support. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came. Instead, she shifted aside, making room. Hayes retrieved a small hammer from the scattered tools. The boy scooted closer, offering a handful of nails with such earnestness that Hayes couldn't help offering a fleeting smile. The child's ribs were faintly visible beneath his shirt, each breath lifting them like fragile scaffolding. His eyes, though, were bright, far brighter than the rest of him suggested possible. And Hayes wondered how such brightness survived months of hunger and fear. They worked in a quiet coordination that surprised all three of them. Hayes hammered gently, careful not to splinter the weakened frame. The widow steadied the boards with steady, determined hands. The boy observed every motion with the seriousness of a soldier in training. Outside, the rain softened to a steady whisper, soaking the ground and drumming lightly on the remaining tiles above. When a final nail slid into place, Hayes stepped back. The door still looked battered, but it stood straighter now, aligned with a kind of dignity that mirrored the family living behind it. He breathed out, ready to excuse himself and return before anyone in his unit questioned his absence. But as he opened his mouth to speak, the boy suddenly broke the silence. "You need a wife," the child announced in German, his voice clear, unhesitating, startlingly direct for someone so small. Hayes blinked, frozen mid-step. The hammer slipped from his hand and landed on the floor with a dull thud. The sentence hung in the air like a flare in a night sky. Bright, shocking, impossible to ignore. For a moment, he wondered if he had misunderstood. But the boy continued, tapping his mother's arm as though introducing an obvious solution to an overlooked problem. And Mama needs a home. The widow's face turned crimson. She inhaled sharply, eyes wide, hands trembling around the wooden beam she still held. A whisper of shame, or fear, or maybe both flickered across her expression. She grabbed the boy's shoulders, murmuring his name in a scolding hush. But the words had already escaped, as unstoppable as the first crack in a dam. Hayes stood speechless. The boy stared at him with pure sincerity, no embarrassment, no awareness of the enormity of what he had said. Only that childish conviction that the world could still be repaired with simple truths. Hayes saw no manipulation there, no calculation. Just longing. Just hunger, not for food, but for stability, for safety, for something that resembled family. The widow finally managed to speak. Hermanies nicked so, she stammered. He doesn't mean it like that. Her voice wavered, trembling at the edges. But the boy frowned, tugging at her sleeve insistently, insisting through posture alone that he meant exactly what he had said. Hayes swallowed hard. Regulations, consequences, duty, each surged into his mind like a rushing tide. The U.S. Army's rules were explicit. No social contact, no emotional entanglements, no crossing the fragile line between conqueror and civilian. Men had been reprimanded for far less. Marriages between Americans and Germans weren't just forbidden. They were unthinkable at this stage. And yet, something in the boy's innocence struck him with more force than any command could counter. He knelt to meet the child's gaze. "Your mother has a home," he whispered gently, hoping to soften the moment, to restore order. But even as he said it, he knew the words rang false. A roof with holes, a door barely hanging on, a kitchen without food. That wasn't a home. That was survival, stretched thin. The widow turned away, her shoulders tightening as though bracing for a blow that hadn't yet arrived. Hayes sensed her fear, not of him, but of hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope invited disappointment. Hope destroyed people far more thoroughly than hunger ever could. He stood slowly, every motion careful. "I should get back," he said. The words tasted sour. He reached for his rifle, but paused when he saw the boy still watching him. Expression open, trusting, unbearably earnest. The rain eased outside. A faint ray of light pushed through the broken rooftop, illuminating the child's face. Hayes felt a tightening in his chest, a silent tug pulling him back toward the doorway he had just repaired. He stepped outside, ready to walk away. But after only a few paces, he stopped. Something in the air had shifted, subtle, invisible, but undeniable. A sentence had been spoken, and the world, in all its ruin, felt tilted by its weight. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The conflict had already crystallized inside him. And though he walked on, each step carried the undeniable truth that the boy's words had lodged themselves deep, waiting to unravel everything he thought he knew about duty, about distance, and about the dangerous possibility of belonging. The days that followed moved with a strange, tentative rhythm, as though the village itself were relearning how to breathe. Patrol routes shifted, checkpoints tightened, and the Americans settled into the uneasy role of caretakers in a land still bristling with the sting of defeat. Yet beneath the uniformity of routine, something unspoken tugged at Private Daniel Hayes' thoughts. A sentence, innocent, reckless, disarming, echoed whenever his mind slipped into stillness. "You need a wife, and Mama needs a home." The boy had spoken it with the simplicity of a prayer, and Hayes found himself unable to forget the weight behind it. 3 mornings after the incident, his unit returned to the same sector for a weapons sweep. Tractors rusted along the roadside, and the ground still bore the gnarled scars of shell fire. The sky was sharp and clear, sunlight exposing every grim detail the rain had softened days earlier. When they passed the widow's cottage, Hayes felt an involuntary tightening in his chest. The repaired door stood where he had left it, sturdier than before yet still unmistakably battered. Smoke drifted faintly from the chimney, thin, humble, but present. It meant warmth. It meant someone inside had enough fuel to stave off the cold, at least for now. Sergeant Collins ordered Hayes to check the southern edge, close to the cottage. Hayes approached with measured steps, reminding himself he was here on duty, not sentiment. But when the widow emerged carrying a bucket of water, her startled expression softened almost immediately. She nodded, hesitant yet genuine. The boy followed her out, a loaf of dark, hard bread tucked under his arm. At the sight of Hayes, he lit up again, a spark of uncomplicated joy in a landscape where joy felt almost illegal. Hayes crouched to inspect a collapsed fence nearby, pretending to assess whether any hiding place might linger beneath it. The boy wandered close, offering a piece of bread with a look that dared him to refuse. Hayes accepted it with a quiet "danky," which made the child grin wide enough to reveal a missing tooth. The widow watched this exchange carefully, protective but no longer alarmed. Her posture betrayed a fragile trust, one easily broken, yet unmistakably there. Later, with permission from Collins to survey the damaged structures, Hayes helped the widow repair her cottage wall. Their cooperation unfolded with a natural ease neither fully meant to encourage. She worked with practiced, economical movements, showing the resilience of someone who had carried a household long before widowhood forced her into roles she never asked for. At times, she corrected Hayes's placement of a stone or nail, a silent reminder that survival had made her knowledgeable in ways war could never prepare him for. He found the subtle irony almost comforting, that the woman he felt compelled to protect possessed a competence that often surpassed his own. The boy stayed close, handing tools, sweeping fragments of plaster, humming tunelessly under his breath. Each small gesture felt like an anchor, binding the three of them into a rhythm more familiar to a family repairing its home than strangers bound by circumstance. Hayes felt something within him ease for the first time since the war began, an uncoiling of tension he hadn't realized he carried. But the world outside their fragile triangle was less forgiving. As Hayes wiped mortar from his hands, he noticed a figure watching from across the lane, a tall man with a coarse jacket and a face hardened by suspicion. The man's gaze lingered, narrowing with the cold precision of someone memorizing a dangerous secret. Hayes recognized the look instantly. Rumor was a currency in post-war Germany, sharp-edged and swift. One whisper could transform kindness into accusation. The widow noticed too. Her shoulders tightened, and her eyes briefly flicked to the ground. Without exchanging a word, both she and Hayes understood the risk his presence created. The man eventually turned and walked on, but the tension he left behind hovered like smoke. Hayes finished as quickly as he could, offering a final nod before rejoining his patrol. The widow's gratitude remained unspoken but clear, her eyes following him with a mixture of relief and worry. The boy raised a small hand in farewell, his fingers dusted with chalky mortar. Hayes lifted his own hand in response, though the gesture felt too small to carry everything he wanted it to. That night, a storm broke across the hills, rattling windows and flooding the trenches the Americans had dug as temporary defenses. Hayes lay awake listening to the thunder roll through the valley, thinking of the sagging roof he hadn't yet helped reinforce. Each crack of thunder made him picture rain seeping through the damaged tiles, dripping onto the widow's floor, soaking the blankets the boy slept under. The war had trained him to ignore discomfort, but tonight discomfort felt like neglect. At dawn, he sought permission to conduct an additional structural survey, using the storm as justification. Collins, exhausted from a night of drainage duty, waved him off with little scrutiny. Hayes made his way back to the cottage through a mist still clinging to the trees. Water pooled along the road, and the sky carried the heavy, washed-out quiet of a world recovering from another night of unrest. The widow stood outside, wringing out a soaked cloth. Her hair was damp, clinging to her temples. She startled when she saw Hayes, but didn't pull away. If anything, a faint relief softened her features. The boy appeared moments later, carrying a tin cup of water he offered solemnly, as if welcoming Hayes into their morning ritual. Inside, the storm's damage was clear. The roof had held, but barely. Water had seeped through in thin rivulets that darkened the wooden floor. Hayes examined the rafters, assessing angles and pressure points with far more care than the task required. The widow watched him, hands clasped, a quiet tension radiating from her. She wasn't afraid of him. She was afraid of needing him. He reinforced the rafters using scavenged planks, working until his arms burned. The widow stayed close, passing tools, steadying boards. At one point her hand brushed his as they both reached for the same nail. They froze, not in alarm, but in the sudden recognition of how thin the barrier between them had become. She withdrew first, her expression unreadable. When they finished, the cottage felt different, less broken, less temporary. The boy beamed at the solid beam Hayes had secured, tapping it proudly, as if claiming authorship of the repair. Hayes laughed despite himself, a sound he hadn't made in months. For a fleeting moment, he let himself imagine belonging in this battered little room. Imagine meals shared, nights quiet, mornings predictable. But imagining was dangerous. He forced the thought away. As he prepared to leave, the widow stepped closer. She opened her mouth as though to speak, but hesitated, struggling for words strong enough to bridge the gulf between fear and gratitude. Finally she whispered, "Danke," nothing more. Yet her voice carried a weight that felt like a confession, or a request she couldn't bring herself to make. Hayes stepped into the fading afternoon light, reluctant in a way he refused to acknowledge. The boy followed him to the doorway, gripping the frame he had repaired. "Call Morgan," he asked softly. "Come tomorrow?" Hayes didn't answer. He couldn't. But as he walked away, he sensed the truth pressing in on him from all sides. Every visit tightened the invisible thread connecting them. And somewhere in the silence of his own footsteps, he realized that if the boy asked again, he wasn't sure he would be able to say no. Winter crept toward Bavaria with an early chill, sharpening the wind that swept through the valley and turning the village's broken edges brittle. Private Daniel Hayes felt the shift the way a seasoned farmer might sense the first threat to his harvest. Not through sight, but through a quiet instinct that warned him time was running out. Orders circulated through the company. Rotation schedules were changing. Some divisions would soon be reassigned. Others would be sent home. The news moved through the barracks like a gust that blew loose papers and loose hearts in every direction. Hayes read the notice twice before folding it into his pocket. The ink felt too heavy, the letters too final. For months he had lived inside a strange boundary, close enough to feel needed, distant enough to obey the rules. Now those rules felt like the only thing standing between him and a decision he had tried not to see forming in himself. Leaving would be simple. Leaving would be expected. And yet the thought of walking away from the widow and her son tightened something deep in his chest in a way no battle ever had. He found himself at the cottage again that afternoon, arriving under a sky the color of pewter. The widow was outside, gathering the last of the firewood stacked against the back wall. The boy knelt nearby, fitting small stones together as though building a fortress. When they saw Hayes, something flickered through their expressions. Hope, relief, and a quiet fear that didn't need translation. "You're leaving," the widow said softly, not as a question, but as recognition. Word traveled quickly in a place where silence was its own form of communication. "Maybe," Hayes replied. It was the most honest answer he could give. "Nothing's certain yet." The boy froze at the word maybe, his small hands still gripping a stone. He looked up sharply, his gaze demanding clarification that Hayes couldn't give. The child understood far more than his age allowed. War had educated him and lost long before childhood should have ended. Hayes joined them by the woodpile, helping stack the last few logs. His hands moved automatically. "No, we can't rebuild Europe without talking to people." The widow's eyes lifted, cautious but curious. "That helps you. It makes things less impossible," Hayes admitted, though the words felt inadequate. She studied him for a long moment, as if memorizing the shape of his face before circumstances redrew it elsewhere. "You have been kind," she said. "Kindness is rare now." He shook his head. "It's not kindness. It's just what feels right." The boy reached across the table then, placing his small hand over Hayes's. His palm was warm, fragile, impossibly earnest. When he spoke, it was not with the naive boldness of the day. He blurted out that world-altering sentence. His voice was softer now, but more certain. "Du gehorst uns," he whispered. "You belong with us." The widow inhaled sharply. Hayes felt the words strike deeper than he expected. They resonated, not as a request, but as a truth he had been circling without admitting. Belonging was a rare thing in a life forged from constant motion and uniformity. Belonging was dangerous. Belonging was exactly what he wanted. A knock at the door broke the moment. Hayes stiffened instinctively. When he opened it, Sergeant Collins stood outside, his expression brisk from the cold and from the business he came to deliver. "Orders came down," Collins said. "You're extended to reconstruction duty if you want it. Voluntary assignment." He paused. "Otherwise, you ship out in 10 days. Hayes felt the world narrow into a single, delicate hinge. Collins glanced past him into the cottage, his eyes taking in the repaired walls, the warm stove, the two figures watching from inside. He said nothing, but his silence carried its own understanding. Then he gave a curt nod and disappeared into the fading light. Hayes closed the door slowly. The cottage felt smaller now, fuller, as though every corner held the echo of the choice before him. But his thoughts drifted. He had grown used to their rhythms. The widow's cautious efficiency, the boy's watchful eagerness, the way the cottage seemed to breathe differently when they all shared the same room. The thought of leaving it all behind felt like stepping out of a warm house into a blizzard. The widow wiped her hands on her apron. "You have family in America?" "A mother," Hayes answered. "A sister." Both waiting. He hesitated before adding, "They'd want me home." She nodded, though her eyes slid briefly toward the ground. She knew the feeling of being waited for, and she knew the ache of waiting without reward. Her husband's telegram had arrived in a thin envelope with a date stamped months before. She had learned then that hope could injure as deeply as sorrow. They stepped inside as the wind picked up. The cottage was warmer than usual, its repaired roof holding back the drafts that had once sliced through the rafters. A small pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with the comforting aroma of potatoes and onions. The widow ladled a portion into a bowl and passed it to Hayes without ceremony. He accepted it with quiet gratitude. Sharing a meal had become their unspoken ritual, a small rebellion against the rules that tried to keep their worlds separate. The boy sat beside him, leaning lightly against his arm, as though proximity alone might anchor Hayes in place. Hayes felt the child's trust settle over him like a whispered plea. It strengthened something in him, but it also made the weight of the coming decision heavier. "Non-fraternization rules are changing," Hayes said suddenly, unsure why he felt the need to explain. Higher ups, the widow stepped closer, her breath unsteady. The boy watched him with that same extraordinary certainty. Hayes realized then that war had taken many things from them. Homes, husbands, safety, sleep, but somehow it had left this unexpected possibility in its wake. A possibility built not on romance or fantasy, but on survival, trust, and the simple human need to stand with someone rather than alone. He exhaled, the decision forming with irreversible clarity. Yet before he could speak, the wind outside surged, rattling the repaired door as if reminding him that even rebuilt things could break again. The sound lingered, trembling through the room, leaving a question suspended between them, one that neither certainty nor duty could answer. And in that unfinished silence, the future began to take shape.